The empathic soul doesn't shatter like glass when it reaches its breaking point. It doesn't explode in theatrical displays of rage or dramatic declarations of independence. Number. When the empath finally awakens to their own worth, they simply withdraw. And in that quiet departure, in that sacred turning inward, lies the most profound disruption the manipulative mind can encounter. This phenomenon, the silent transformation of the soul who once absorbed every wound, mirrored every need, carried every burden, is not merely psychological. It is archetypal. It represents what I have long described as the return of the exiled self, the resurrection of authentic power from beneath the rubble of endless accommodation. When this moment arrives, when the empath steps back from the theater of others' dramas, it is not withdrawal born of weakness, but recognition born of wisdom. A sudden, often startling realization that they have been participating in dynamics that serve everyone except themselves, feeding systems that consume their light while offering nothing but the illusion of connection in return. The empathic being was never designed merely to absorb. They were created to perceive, yes, to feel the hidden currents of human emotion, but also to illuminate, to shine light into the dark corners of the human psyche. This gift, however divine in its origins, becomes a curse when placed in service to those who prefer darkness to awareness, manipulation to authenticity. The narcissistic dynamic dash, the narcissistic consciousness, that fragmented deity of false mirrors, exists in a state of perpetual hunger for reflection. Their entire psychological architecture depends upon external validation, constant mirroring, the presence of others who will confirm their distorted self-image. They don't seek love in the true sense. They seek confirmation. They don't desire connection. They require control. So when the empath, who has been slowly drowning in this sea of projected need, finally surfaces and gasps for their own breath, something ancient stirs within them. I have witnessed this pattern countless times in the depths of analytical work, in the symbolic landscape of dreams, in the mythological echoes that guide human transformation. The empath, often unconscious of their own radiance, becomes entangled with what we might call the wounded sovereign, the narcissistic personality. This isn't mere attraction, but unconscious contract, a dance of complementary shadows. The empath believes their sensitivity can heal the other's fragmentation. They mistake their permeability for medicine, their absorption for love. But here lies the psychological trap. The empath begins to fragment themselves in service of the other's wholeness. They confuse boundaries with coldness, self-care with selfishness, their own needs with demands they have no right to make. Slowly, incrementally, they forget their own voice, their own needs, their own sacred center from which all authentic healing flows. This forgetting isn't benign. It represents a form of soul murder, a gradual dissolution of the essential self. It manifests not only in psychological symptoms, the anxiety, the depression, the chronic fatigue, but in the very quality of their dreams, their creativity, their connection to the numinous dimension of existence. The empath begins to feel like a ghost haunting their own life. They move through relationships and situations without recognizing their own reflection. The persona they wear becomes heavier each day, more suffocating, more removed from the authentic self that waits in the shadows of consciousness. The awakening dash. But the psyche has its own intelligence, its own protective mechanisms. When the soul can no longer sustain the weight of self-betrayal, it doesn't request permission to heal. It simply begins the process. Often through dreams that speak in symbols of drowning and emergence, of prisons and escapes, of death and rebirth. This is the awakening, not an explosion but an implosion, not a breaking but a breakthrough. The empath doesn't lash outward, but turns inward, beginning the sacred work of reclaiming the projections they have cast upon others, retrieving pieces of themselves they have scattered in service of external approval. The manipulative personality, of course, never anticipates this transformation, because they never truly perceive the empath as a separate being to begin with. In their psychological landscape, the empath existed as an extension of themselves, a mirror, a tool, a source of the validation they cannot generate internally. When the empath suddenly becomes unavailable for this function, when they withdraw their energy from the dynamic, it creates a vacuum that forces the narcissistic consciousness to confront what they most fear, their own emptiness and their own wounds, their own responsibility for their inner state. There's a profound reason why the narcissistic mind seeks the empathic soul. It's not love they pursue, but reflection. They recognize in the empath what they buried long ago in their own psyche, the capacity for genuine feeling, for authentic grief, for real healing. The empath becomes a living reminder of their own disowned sensitivity. But rather than face this truth, they attempt to possess it, to bind the empath to their unhealed inner child and call this bondage love. The empath, conditioned by cultural narratives that equate sacrifice with virtue, often accepts this role as their spiritual destiny. They endure, they forgive, they understand, and in doing so, they reinforce the other's illusion that their wounds are more important, their needs more urgent, and their healing more vital than anyone else's. But the soul, as I've said, has its limits. Reclaiming power. The empath awakens not in hatred but in recognition. It's the same movement described in all authentic spiritual traditions. The moment when the false self dissolves and the true self begins to emerge. It's not clean, not comfortable, not easily explained to those who have never made this journey. The empath begins to see that their endless compassion was often not compassion at all, but fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of conflict, fear of being deemed unworthy unless they were perpetually useful. This recognition initiates a spiral descent into the unconscious, a retrieval of all they have given away in the name of keeping peace. They begin to reclaim their voice, their anger, their right to exist without constant justification. They stop rescuing and start remembering. They cease absorbing others' emotions and begin feeling their own. In this process, a profound reversal occurs, where once they were dependent on external approval, they become immune to external manipulation. They see the patterns clearly, name the dynamics accurately, break the spells that kept them bound. And in this moment of clarity, the narcissistic consciousness experiences something akin to panic. Not because they missed a person, but because their primary source of psychological supply has been severed. This moment transcends the merely personal. It echoes through archetypal dimensions, Persephone returning from the underworld, the wounded healer remembering their own medicine, the enslaved God breaking free from the chains of projection. It's often accompanied by dreams of fire, of floods, of phoenixes rising from ash. The soul begins cleansing itself of the false narratives it was forced to live, the roles it was required to play, the identity it constructed around being needed rather than being authentic. This is not failure, but resurrection, not breakdown, but breakthrough, not weakness, but the emergence of a power that cannot be manipulated or controlled. When the empath completes this transformation, they return to the world as something entirely different, no longer the absorber of others' chaos, but the mirror of truth. No longer the rescuer of the unwilling, but the embodiment of what wholeness looks like when it refuses to fragment itself for others' comfort. Let's descend deeper into the symbolic architecture of this transformation, for it operates through layers of meaning that extend far beyond individual psychology into the realm of collective healing and ancestral repair. The empathic awakening represents more than personal recovery. It signifies the rupture of generational patterns, the breaking of ancestral contract that demanded silence, self-sacrifice, and the endless absorption of others' unprocessed pain. The empath who awakens doesn't simply leave a relationship. They step out of an inherited role that may have been passed down through bloodlines for generations. This is psychogenealogical reality. The empath often carries the unexpressed grief of the family system, becomes the emotional repository for traumas that others refuse to acknowledge. As children, they learned to read danger in the quality of silence, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to regulate the emotional atmosphere through their own internal weather. When they encounter the narcissistic consciousness in adult relationships, it isn't coincidence but recognition. The same patterns of emotional neglect dressed in adult clothing, manipulation disguised as intimacy, control masquerading as care. Yet this meeting, however painful, serves as initiation. The narcissistic personality becomes the unwitting catalyst for the empath's awakening. It's only through being consumed that the empath remembers their own hunger. Only through invisibility that they reclaim the right to be seen. Only through the death of the false self that the authentic self can be reborn. What emerges from this process is an empath transformed, no longer seeking to emerge but to meet, no longer given to be needed but sharing from overflow, no longer attracted to those who require rescue but drawn to those who reflect wholeness. The shift cannot be performed or pretended. It represents a fundamental alteration in the frequency of their being. The empath who has integrated their shadow, their capacity for healthy selfishness, appropriate anger, necessary boundaries, no longer broadcasts availability for exploitation. They have learned to distinguish between genuine calls for help and manipulative demands for energy, between authentic vulnerability and performed helplessness. In the language of alchemy, this represents the phase of conjunction, the sacred marriage between the masculine and feminine principles within the psyche. The need to seek completion through others dissolves as inner union is achieved. From this integration, the empath becomes not a seeker, but a source, not a vessel to be filled by others, but a well that springs from its own depths, the narcissist's path. and lack thereof. The narcissistic consciousness, meanwhile, remains frozen in the trauma of a fractured ego, a psyche that learns survival through domination rather than connection. They aren't evil but wounded, not malicious but terrified of the vulnerability that true healing requires. But healing the narcissist is not the empath's task. The empath's work is to withdraw the projections, to reclaim the parts of themselves that believed love must hurt to be real. If transformation ever comes to the narcissistic personality, it must arise from their own confrontation with emptiness, their own willingness to face the void they have spent lifetimes avoiding. Most never undertake this journey because to awaken from narcissism requires the death of the false self, the collapse of the grandiose persona constructed to protect the wounded core. Few possess the courage for such dissolution, so they seek new mirrors, new empaths, new sources of the reflection they cannot provide for themselves. This is why the awakened empath must speak, not to the narcissist, but to the world, to the other empaths still sleeping in the wrong story, still giving their lives away, drop by drop. The transformed empath becomes a beacon, not because they preach, but because they embody what liberation looks like. They begin to express their truth through art, through teaching, through the simple but revolutionary act of living authentically. The words carry weight because they have been tested in the fire of transformation. Their presence heals because it demonstrates that wholeness is possible without the sacrifice of self. Living authentically, no longer obsessed with being liked, they become devoted to being real, no longer driven by the need to be understood. They trust their own inner knowing, no longer seeking validation from those incapable of seeing them. They attract mirrors that reflect the truth rather than their wounds. This evolution echoes through mythology and spiritual tradition, the wounded healer becoming the wise teacher, the silenced child becoming the prophetic voice, the absorbed empath becoming the sovereign soul. Their transformation serves not only personal healing but collective awakening. In a world addicted to domination over connection, performance over presence, consumption over intimacy, the awakened empath represents a different possibility. They embody what relationship looks like when built on truth rather than trauma, choice rather than compulsion, mutual respect rather than unconscious exploitation. Their very existence challenges the systems that require empaths to remain unconscious, systems that profit from the endless giving of those who have forgotten how to receive. The awakened empath refuses to play by rules that demand their diminishment as the price of belonging. This path requires courage. The courage to sit in the discomfort of others' disappointment without immediately moving to soothe it. The courage to prioritize inner truth over external harmony. The courage to choose solitude over soul-destroying connection. There will be grief in this journey. The empath must mourn the version of themselves that stayed small to feel safe, must release the people who only loved their wounded, accommodating self, must let go of the stories that made the suffering feel meaningful. But after the mourning comes the clarity, the deep exhale of a soul that no longer holds its breath, waiting for others' approval. The colors return to their world. The body softens from its chronic state of hypervigilance, and they discover they are not empty without the drama. They are free. Freedom, they learn, is not the absence of relationship, but the presence of choice. Not the end of love, but the beginning of love that includes the self. Not isolation, but the kind of solitude that nourishes rather than depletes. The awakened empath discovers sovereignty, not dominance over others, but complete ownership of their own psychic territory. They become unmovable not through hardness, but through rootedness. Unmanipulable not through coldness, but through clarity. At this stage, they no longer define themselves in opposition to anyone. Their identity is not the one who survived or the one who escaped, but simply the one who is. Present, authentic, whole. They have learned to see without needing to fix, to feel without absorbing, to love without losing themselves. This vision emerges from their integration of shadow. The empath's journey is not about eliminating pain, but metabolizing it. Not about becoming perfect, but becoming complete. They learn to hold their anger with compassion, their selfishness without shame, their need for control without judgment. What was once rejected as dark is revealed as simply unexamined life, unexpressed truth wrapped in fear. When the empath finally dares to feel their rage, to name their needs, to honor their boundaries, the split within begins to heal. The psychic pressure releases. The soul begins to breathe again. The narcissistic consciousness served as teacher of the shadow, but only because the empath finally stopped dancing to their tune. Until then, they were trapped in projection, confusing external chaos for internal truth. But when they turned the mirror inward and asked, "Why was I drawn to this dynamic?" the real work began. They discovered the child within, the sensitive, watchful one who learned that love meant sacrifice, that attention had to be earned, that existing came with conditions. When they hold this child not as a problem, but as a treasure, the past begins to release its grip on the present. This is deep psychic repair, the kind that cannot be rushed through willpower, but emerges through presence, patience, and the gradual reweaving of trust within the self. With every act of self-honoring, every boundary set, every need expressed, every moment of rest taken without guilt, new neural pathways form, new possibilities emerge. Relationships transform from crutches to mirrors. The awakened empath no longer seeks completion in others, but resonance with others. They can feel the pull of old patterns, but instead of falling into them unconsciously, they witness them with awareness. "Ha," they say quietly, "here is the part that once needed chaos to feel alive." And then they choose differently. This is mastery. Not perfection, but awareness. Not invulnerability, but choice. Love transforms from suffering to practice, from performance to presence, from desperation to generosity. It develops roots not in fantasy, but in shared truth, becoming not something to cling to, but something to embody. The frequency of the awakened empath changes completely. They may still feel deeply, but they are no longer defined by emotional overwhelm. Instead, they are characterized by clarity, by presence, by what the mystics call sacred restraint, knowing when to engage and when to withdraw, when to speak and when to remain silent. The narcissistic consciousness, if they observe from afar, cannot comprehend this transformation. The empath no longer responds to provocation, no longer defends against accusations, no longer participates in the drama, that once defined their interaction, they have become truly sovereign, unshakable not through hardness but through centeredness. This sovereignty extends beyond personal relationships into every dimension of their existence. They become less willing to enable dysfunctional systems, less available for organizational emotional labor that maintains toxic cultures, less tolerant of collective dynamics that require self-betrayal as the price of inclusion. Their awakening ripples outward, affecting everyone in this sphere, not because they preach, but because they embody a different way of being. They demonstrate that it is possible to care without caring, to love without losing oneself, to serve without self-abandonment. The empath becomes dangerous in the most sacred way, dangerous to every system built on the unconsciousness of those who give their power away. They represent the possibility of evolution, the potential for humanity to move beyond domination into cooperation, beyond exploitation into reciprocity. Their presence makes pretense difficult to maintain. Their authenticity exposes the masks others wear. Their boundaries force others to take responsibility for their own emotional states. Their clarity reflects back the truth that many would prefer to avoid. Some will be threatened by this evolution, and they will attempt to shame the awakened empath back into their former role. They will call them selfish, cold, different, but the empath who has tasted freedom will not return to prison willingly. They have learned that the comfort of others is not their responsibility, that their worth is not determined by their utility. The final phase of this transformation involves what I call sacred service, giving that flows from fullness rather than emptiness, helping that empowers rather than enables, love that includes appropriate boundaries. The awakened empath serves not from wound but from wholeness, not from guilt but from genuine care. They become lighthouses, not rescuing every ship but shining consistently, reminding others of the shore within themselves. Their very existence proves that transformation is possible, that healing can occur, that the cycle of unconscious wounding can be broken. The gift reclaimed. And what of their gift? The empathic sensitivity that once made them vulnerable to exploitation becomes, when properly channeled, their greatest strength. No longer leaked away unconsciously, becomes focused, intentional, powerful. They use it to create rather than absorb, to build rather than rescue, to illuminate rather than sacrifice. They learn the difference between empathy and enmeshment, between compassion and codependence, between love and self-abandonment. Their sensitivity becomes a precision instrument rather than an open wound, serving consciousness rather than unconsciousness. The awakened empath walks through the world as a living demonstration of what wholeness looks like. Not perfect, but integrated, not invulnerable, but boundaried, not hard, but discerning. They have learned to channel their gift in service of truth rather than in service of others' comfort. Their presence becomes a prayer, their boundaries a teaching, their authenticity an invitation for others to remember their own truth. They no longer apologize for their existence or negotiate their worth. They simply are, fully, completely, unapologetically themselves. This is the revolution that occurs when the empath awakens. Not loud but profound, not violent but transformative, not demanding but inspiring. They become the change they once sought to create in others, the love they once begged to receive from those incapable of giving it. In their presence, masks become uncomfortable to wear, pretense becomes exhausting to maintain, truth becomes the only currency that holds value. They force the world to become more honest simply by refusing to participate in collective dishonesty. The narcissistic consciousness may never understand what they lost when the empath withdrew. To them, people are either useful or useless, sources of supply or obstacles to overcome. They cannot comprehend the treasure they held in their hands because they never learned to value what they could not control. But the empath, now sovereign, no longer measures their worth by others' ability to recognize it. They have learned that their value is intrinsic. Their light is their own. Their path is theirs to walk. They need no external validation because they have developed unshakable internal validation. They become mysterious in the deepest sense, not because they hide, but because they no longer perform. They become magnetic, not through effort, but through authenticity. They become powerful, not through force, but through presence. And if you recognize yourself in this journey, know this. You are not broken, but breaking open. You are not too much, but more than the unconscious world knows how to hold. You are not here to save anyone, but to remember yourself. The revolution begins within, and from there it transforms everything it touches. The empath who awakens becomes a beacon for all who still sleep in the wrong story, still give their lives away, still believe love requires self-destruction. Your transformation is not just personal. It is transpersonal, not just healing but revolutionary. So awaken, sovereign soul. Reclaim your projection. Retrieve your power. Return to yourself. The world needs not your sacrifice, but your wholeness. Not your wounds, but your wisdom. Not your compliance, but your truth. Let them wonder where you went. Let them discover who they are without your light to distract them from their darkness. You were never theirs to possess. You are the mirror they could not break. The truth they could not bend, the light they could not dim. And now, finally, you are your own.